this video, we are going to talk about cardiac cycle. When we mention the word cardiac cycle, you're actually talking about including all the events that are associated with one heartbeat. With one heartbeat. Our heart beats, and it is during this beats only that there is the contraction and relaxation, that is the flowing of the blood. Everything is happening in that heartbeat. So when we're talking about cardiac cycle, we're basically talking about the events that associate or that create a heartbeat. So what is a heartbeat then? What is a heartbeat? Well, if I have to talk about it, heartbeat is nothing but one contraction plus one relaxation of the heart. All right, when I say one contraction, that means one contraction of the ventricles and the atrium, atria, and relaxation is again one relaxation of the ventricles and atria. So this cycle creates one heartbeat, and whatever events that are associated in creating the contraction of the ventricles and atria and further relaxation of the ventricles and atria all form what is called as the cardiac cycle. Right, now normally a normal heartbeat in an average adult, irrespective of the gender, a healthy adult is 72 to 78 beats per minute. BPM is beats per minute, means each time an average adult's heart beats among 72 to 78 minutes per minute. And for the phase during which the heart is in contraction, when the heart is in the contraction phase, that phase is called systolic phase. Or systole. Similarly, when the heart is in its relaxation phase, then that phase is called as a diastolic phase or diastole. All right, now as we have said, there are events that are associated with heartbeat. So there are three major events that are associated in one heartbeat or generate one heartbeat, which form the basis of the cardiac cycle. So what are the three events? The three events are basically described as atrial systole. First one is atrial systole. Second one is ventricular diastole, and third one is joint diastole. So these are the three phases that are present, or the three events that are associated with a heartbeat. Now I am going to show them in this pie diagram as to explain how long each phase will or each event will last. Now the smallest phase of the entire cardiac cycle, the smallest event of the three which lasts for a limited time, is this event that is happening here. Okay, now this event here is the first event that will be happening, and this one is called as arterial diastole. This is atrial or auricular systole, and this lasts for only 0.1 seconds. So the period of this is only 0.1 seconds. Coming to the second phase that will be followed here, that is the second event, which is comparatively a little longer than your common atrial diastole, will be the phase of ventricular systole. So this is the second phase, and this second phase belongs to ventricular systole. And the time period for this is 0.3 seconds. Right. After that, the maximum time that is seen here, this belongs to the joint diastole. The joint diastole, which lasts for 0.4 seconds. So that means the total cardiac cycle, one cardiac cycle lasts for 0.8 seconds per cycle, which will give rise to one heartbeat. So your heart beats for every 0.8 seconds, it beats once, and that means that is because of all the events that are happening in the cardiac cycle, which lasts for a total of 0.8 seconds. So let us just put our joint diastole's color also here in the pie diagram, so to make it look very beautiful. So we are going to put the diagram, and I'm going to come back. Right, so this is the joint diastole. So when we are talking about a cardiac cycle, we are basically talking about, in each cardiac cycle, there is the contraction, the alternate contractions of the atria and the ventricle, followed by a stage where there is the joint diastole. Joint diastole means what? There is this complete relaxation of both the chambers. So there is simultaneous alternate contraction of both the chambers and a relaxation of the both the chambers. That forms one cardiac cycle. And when the artery and ventricle alternately contract and relax, what it does is it creates, or it provides a condition where it forces blood out. Out from where? A region of high blood pressure to a region of low blood pressure. So this alternate contraction relaxation of ventricles and atrium, or the chambers of the heart, what it creates is it creates a blood pressure, and this increased blood pressure pushes the blood out of the heart from its high blood pressure region to low blood pressure region. So this is the introduction of the cardiac cycle. So now what we are going to see is, we are going to see the events in detail that occur in the cardiac. We are going to start with arterial systole, and in arterial systole already you can see that the atrium are already filled with blood. You can see that the atrium, they are already filled with blood, right? So this is the left atrium and this is the right atrium, and they're already filled with blood. Left atrium is filled with oxygenated blood and right atrium is filled with deoxygenated blood. Okay, this is something we already know. Now what happens is, there will be the impulse that is generated from the pacemaker. So you have the pacemaker, and from the pacemaker you have the impulse that will be generated throughout the left atrium and the right atrium. And what this will do, this will result in the contraction of the heart atrium. So this results in the contraction of the atrium. Now once this contraction of the atrium begins, what happens is, it creates a blood pressure. It elevates, blood pressure is increased in the atrial chambers, and as a result the valves open. What are the valves that are associated here? There are two major valves that are associated, the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve. So the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves, they open up. Okay, so they open up, and this results in what? It will result in the flow of the blood into the ventricles. So slowly the blood from the arterioles, it will start to enter into the ventricles. So the valves open, and like this slowly the ventricles will start to fill with the blood. Okay, the ventricles will slowly start to fill with the blood from the arterium, and these are the valves here, the bicuspid valve and the tricuspid valve, and like this the blood will flow inside. Now this entire atrial contraction, it lasts for 0.1 seconds. The duration is 0.1 seconds. Now after this, the next step after arterial contraction will be the next contraction, the alternate contraction of the ventricles. Now both these images that I have added belong to ventricular systole, that is contraction of the ventricles. But here there is a slight difference. In the first image, that is, let us say 2A and 2B, we'll call this image as 2A and we'll call it 2B. Right, in the 2A image, if you can see, there is already the ventricles that are filled with the blood. So the left ventricle and the right ventricle are filled with the blood. The valves closed here, the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves closed, but the semilunar valves, that is the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve, this is the pulmonary valve and this is the aortic valve, they are also still closed. So what happens here? In 2A, what is happening is the impulse is carried out from the AVN to AVB bundles. So there is the carrying of the impulse from the pacemaker to the AVN and AVB bundles, and there is ventricular depolarization. So this starts with ventricular depolarization. Ventricular depolarization, but in 2A the polarization has not reached to the full potential. That means the entire ventricles have not started to polarize. It is only might be limited to till this part of the septum, that is, it is only reached to the bundle of the His and the fascicles. It has not reached to the Purkinje fibers. So this condition is called isovolumetric contraction. So here it is called as isovolumetric contraction. This stage where the ventricles are not fully under contraction, and that is why both the pulmonary valve and aortic valves are closed. The ventricles started to contract but not in complete contraction. Okay, so because of that, there is this equal iso means what? Iso means equal same type of contraction. So this period is called as same contraction or isovolumetric contraction. Now, due to this, it generates the lub sound. The lub sound. Heart has two sounds, lub dub, lub dub, lub dub, right? So that lub sound is generated during this isovolumetric contraction, because when ventricular contraction begins, the tricuspid, this lub bit sound is due to the closure of the aortic valves, that is the atrial valves, that is the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves, they are closing, and this creates the sound which is the S1 sound or the lub sound. Okay, now this volumetric contraction lasts for 0.05 seconds. Okay, and it is only at this phase, not only your tricuspid and bicuspid valves are closed, the pulmonary and the aortic valves are also closed. Remember, when I'm telling you about valves, I said that there will be a point in the heartbeat where all the four valves will be closed. That will be during two stages, isovolumetric contraction and isovolumetric relaxation. At this stage only all the four valves will be closed. So here it is isovolumetric contraction. Ventricular contraction began, which closed the tricuspid and bicuspid valves, but the ventricular pressure is not that much to open the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve. So this phase is called as the isovolumetric contraction. Slowly the contraction will reach all the way to the entire ventricles through the Purkinje fibers, and this results in complete ventricular contraction. So this results in complete ventricular contraction. ventricular contraction. Now once ventricles start to contract, what they'll do, they will develop pressure. There will be a pressure, that is left ventricle will have a pressure of more than 8 mm of Hg. Okay, right ventricle will develop a pressure of somewhere around 20 mm of Hg. Now both these pressures are more than the pressures of the aortic trunk, that is the aortic valve, and even the pulmonary trunk. So the ventricles now are having a high blood pressure, whereas the pulmonary trunk and the aorta are having a low pressure. So this high pressure, what it does, it forces the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve to open. This forces the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve to open. Here you can see in the image both the valves are open. Now once this are opened, then what happens, there will be the ventricular ejection. Means all the blood, whatever blood it is there, it will move. The pressure of the ventricle slowly will rise from 80 to almost 120 mm of Hg. The contraction keeps on proceeding. The pressure of the ventricles will reach to 120. The pressure of right ventricle will reach to 35 mm, and then suddenly there will be the ventricular ejection, where the blood from the right ventricle will flow into the pulmonary trunk and blood from the left ventricle will flow into the aorta. So at this pressure, at this high pressure, you will have ventricular ejection, that is pushing of the blood from the left ventricle and right ventricle into their respective pulmonary and systemic trunk. So now you understand what is happening. At the beginning, because the contraction is only to the septum, only the valves close. Once the contraction, the impulse reaches completely to the ventricles, the valves open, the pressure inside the valve started to build. Once that pressure reaches to a certain amount, which is 120 mm and 35 mm, the blood in the ventricles is pushed into the pulmonary trunk and into the aorta, which is a process called as ventricular ejection. So this is the first three parts steps, that is, or rather the first two steps of the entire cardiac cycle, that is atrial systole and ventricular systole, and we also saw how the lub sound has come. Now let us go to the next part. Now, as we were talking about it, we are going to talk to the next stage, that is joint diastole. In the joint diastole, again, I have given two images, 3A and 3B. Now, in 3A, atrium are already under diastole. Atrium are already under diastole. That means they are already relaxed. Now, what happens after the ventricular ejection? The ventricle starts to relax. The ventricle diastole begins. It has not reached the maximum, but it will begin. Okay, so the ventricle diastole begins, and how is it beginning? It is beginning due to repolarization. Remember, depolarization and repolarization. So the repolarization creates the ventricular diastole. It begins it. Now, when the ventricle diastole begins, what happens is there will be a decrease in the ventricular pressure. The ventricular pressure decreases. Remember in the previous section, in the previous ventricular systole, we saw that how the ventricular pressure was increasing due to the contraction. Now when the ventricles are relaxing, the pressure will decrease. And what happens to this pressure? Because of this pressure, there is a problem. There will be a chance that there will be backflow of blood. Backflow of blood can happen. From where? From the aorta and the pulmonary trunk back to the ventricles. It will try to happen. It won't happen, but it will try to happen. So to prevent that, you need to prevent it. You need to prevent it. So what happens? There will be the closure. There will be the closure of the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve. So these two valves, they are closed. And if they are closed, what happens? Even if the pressure decreases, even if the ventricular pressure is decreasing, the blood cannot come back because the valves are closed. This produces the second sound of the heart, which is short and high pitched, called as the dub sound. Okay, so when the semilunar valves, or that is the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve, are closing during the ventricular diastole beginning, that produces the dub sound. Okay, now if you see here, what happened? The aortic valve is closed, the pulmonary valve is closed, and the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves are also closed. So all the four valves again are closed, just like in isovolumetric contraction. But this time it is not isovolumetric contraction, but it is isovolumetric relaxation. I've told you now, all the valves will be closed during two stages: isovolumetric relaxation and isovolumetric contraction. So this is isovolumetric contraction, isovolumetric relaxation, where all the four valves are again closed. Now, slowly, what happens? The ventricle completely starts to relax. So there is complete relaxation of the ventricle. Complete relaxation of the ventricle. Okay, now when 3A and 3B are happening, something else also keeps happening here. The blood will slowly start to come into the atriums. The atrium slowly will start to get filled with blood, not completely, slowly, and this will keep on going in the 3B section also. So let me just take another. So there is already, the blood has started to flow inside the atrium. So now ventricles are completely relaxed. Ventricles are completely relaxed, and the pressure in the ventricles, it keeps on decreasing. The ventricular pressure keeps on decreasing. Now, due to this, what happens? If you can see here, the valves got opened. So this results in the opening of the tricuspid and bicuspid valves. Opening of the tricuspid and bicuspid valves. Only just the opening. The blood will not flow yet. Why will the blood not flow? The blood will not flow because the arterial pressure did not reach the level. The atrial pressure is still not at the level, of contraction. Atrial contraction just did not happen. Why? Because there is no atrium is also relaxed. Atrial contraction only creates the atrial pressure, but here what is happening? Along with the ventricle, even the atrium are relaxed. Atrium are also relaxed. That's why it's called joint diastole. Now, why are you calling it joint diastole? Both atria and ventricles are in diastole, are in relaxation. That's why it's called joint diastole. So even though the blood is filled with here, even though the valves are open, blood will not flow into the ventricles. That will only flow when there is atrial contraction. So this is cardiac cycle. In the next section, we are going to talk about the volume, cardiac output, blood pressure, and pulse.
For more content, like, share and subscribe to www.i-win.in.